It's the TMZ Behind the Bar podcast with the TMZ lawyers, Jason Beckerman and Derek Kaufman.
Welcome, everyone, to the Behind the Bar podcast, where each week we bring a legal perspective to the biggest stories in celebrity news. I'm Jason Beckerman.
And I'm Derek Kaufman.
Before we start, Derek, we need to thank everyone for all the help they've given us in growing this podcast. Last week, 165,000 people listened to the podcast, our biggest audience to date.
Staggering.
We could not be more excited about the response we received.
That's right. And in fact, we received the topic for this week's podcast from a listener, Jason.
We got somebody actually wrote in the topic.
Yes, a Mr. Robert Ketch emailed us at behindthebar@tmz.com and asked if we'd talk about whether a President Donald Trump, if he wins the election, could legally back up the threat he made during last Sunday's debate to appoint a special prosecutor to go after Hillary and throw her in jail.
So Derek and I spent a lot of time researching this topic over the last 4 or 5 days, and the answer is yes, he could appoint a special prosecutor to go after her. Sort of. Maybe.
Ugh.
Depends on really how you look at it.
Yeah.
Parker, can you remind us what Donald Trump said during last week's debate about Hillary Clinton and trying to prosecute her?
I am going to instruct my Attorney General to get a special prosecutor to look into your situation, because there has never been so many lies, so much deception. There has never been anything like it, and we're going to have a special prosecutor.
So you heard the threat there, and if Donald Trump is elected president, he can absolutely carry through on this threat to a point. The independent counsel law, as Derek, I know, was enacted in 1978 in direct response to a little thing we like to call Watergate.
A little scandal.
It basically allows either the president or Congress or the judiciary to appoint an independent counsel. Hopefully that person's nonpartisan. Hopefully they're totally independent, to look into the alleged wrongdoings of politicians. It came out of Watergate because Watergate, Archibald Cox, the special counsel in that case, there were all these accusations that he was appointed because he was a political crony and wasn't actually independent. So they've done their best to get this idea out of politics that we can only have partisan people look into these things, get independent people looking. Ken Starr was put forward to.
Cox was the special prosecutor.
Archibald Cox was the special prosecutor.
And he had a famous angry firing by Nixon.
That's right.
He didn't want to answer the subpoena anymore.
That's right. So the independent counsel or special prosecutor will have the ability to convene grand juries, try to get indictments. Presidents, obviously, they get impeached, but former secretaries of state who are no longer in office don't get impeached. They get indicted, tried, and if appropriate, they get sentenced for their crimes if they're found guilty. So yes, it's theoretically possible that Donald Trump would, in fact, try to get Hillary Clinton convicted for the alleged deletion of the vast quantities of email from a private server, which he said were in contravention to security laws and the laws that restrict the actions of the Secretary of State. But there is one huge caveat. Derek, the election's on November 8th. If Donald Trump wins, does he take office that day?
He does not. We've got a lame duck for 2.5 months, right?
That's right. And during the 2.5-month period, which Barack Obama is still president, what is he absolutely sure to do if Donald Trump's been elected?
He's going to use that pardon power.
He's going to use the pardon power.
Yeah.
So you guys
every president does it.
That's right. You're all familiar with this, right? Presidents have the absolute right to pardon anyone they want except for themselves. In the case of they're still sitting in office, they can't stop themselves from being impeached. But they can pardon anybody else for the commission of federal crimes. Here, once again, the deletion of emails would be an allegation of a federal crime.
This is core federal stuff. It's about
Yes.
national security. So
That's
this is
right.
a core function of the job of Secretary of State. That's a federal crime.
So every president has done this to Derek's point, except for two. Any ideas which two?
Oh, my goodness. Wait, I do want to know this. It has to be really short-termers.
The two short-termers.
So William Henry Harrison,
Yes.
he died right after his inauguration speech.
Yes.
No time to pardon. The other one would be, I don't know, Zachary Taylor.
James Garfield, he was assassinated shortly after his inauguration as well. He was president for a very short period of time, right?
Very short, one year.
They did not pardon anyone because they didn't have time to. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the longest-serving president, pardoned 2,480 people.
Yikes.
President Obama has issued relatively few pardons, just 64, but that stands to reason because the vast majority of pardons are given by presidents right before they leave office. They're lame ducks. They're not going to pay a political price for this. You saw this. Bill Clinton famously pardoned Mark Rich, who was one of his political cronies who was being charged with corruption in association with his conduct in the Whitewater real estate scandal, which implicated the president, but he pardoned Mark Rich.
These numbers are staggering to me, though.
Yeah.
Like, I know FDR was president for, he was elected to 4
years.
terms,
Yeah.
but thousands of pardons. We have only heard of
Navy.
maybe Mark Rich and my guy.
So before we start here, you guys, Derek, there is obviously the most famous presidential pardon in history. Why don't you tell us about that?
The most famous presidential pardon in history is Gerald Ford pardoning Richard Nixon. So everyone remembers famously during the Watergate scandal, Nixon eventually resigned. He did not get impeached.
Right, because the evidence had mounted against him. They were threatening to impeach him.
And really, who knows whether he'd have been impeached. I mean, he could have skated, but
Derek,
he decided to, for the good of the country, step down.
Derek, the last of the Nixon apologists.
And he put up the famous hands, and he stepped out of office. He said the nation shouldn't go through this. So Gerald Ford pardoned him after, stepped into office, was never elected to either vice president or president, little Jerry Ford trivia, and he ended our long national nightmare.
That's right. And actually, we have the clip. Go ahead, Parker. Play us that clip of Jerry Ford.
My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over.
So Ford paid an enormous political price for having pardoned Richard Nixon.
The ultimate.
Right. He likely lost the 1976 election to Jimmy Carter on the basis of the fact that the country was outraged by the fact he had issued this presidential pardon to Richard Nixon. But it shows the great breadth of the presidential pardon power, right? There's no limits to it. Any federal crime can be pardoned with the stroke of a pen by the president. No congressional oversight, no judicial oversight. It's right there in the Constitution that the president shall have this power. Right. Obama doesn't have the same political concerns in pardoning Hillary Clinton
termed out.
As Gerald Ford did, because he's termed out, and he has said he never wants to run for political office again.
Right.
Harvey's got this cockamamie theory that President Obama is going to head up a Hollywood studio at some point, which seems, why would anybody who's that sort of successful want to mire themselves in the muck of Hollywood?
And he's a community organizer before this, so I don't know that that's in his DNA just because he's been on The Tonight Show a bunch. But
right.
Who knows?
So practically speaking, there's no way in the world that Donald Trump will ever be able to bring President Donald Trump would ever be able to bring these charges against Hillary Clinton or appoint the special prosecutor, because President Obama would certainly pardon her. But theoretically, yes, he can absolutely appoint the prosecutor and absolutely theoretically get her indicted. So, Robert, thank you so much for the suggestion of the topic. We've taken it and broadened it a little bit more beyond just the attempt by a President Donald Trump to convict Hillary Clinton for her alleged crimes. He's made some other sort of statements that were huge. They've gotten a lot of news, both good and bad, about what he would want to do when he was president. What's another one, Derek, that we can look at and see if it's legally enforceable or legally binding?
Here's something else Donald Trump wants to do if he becomes president.
Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what the hell is going on.
So obviously this was huge news, right? I mean, this is very inflammatory stuff because one of the core American values is that we don't have religious tests, is what we call it. So everyone picked this up and said, what does he mean? Does he actually want to block people by just having them check a box saying if they're a Muslim, they're not allowed in this country? And that's exactly what he wants to do. And this struck people as antithetical to American values,
It strikes me not only as antithetical, but blatantly unconstitutional, right? We have the First Amendment, which restricts Congress from passing any law that discriminates on the basis of religion, right?
Yeah, you would think. The First Amendment does read that way, but there's something that trumps the First Amendment in this instance, and that's called the plenary powers doctrine, which says the executive has plenary power, all-encompassing absolute power over immigration laws. And this sort of makes sense, right? This is an issue of national security. Who you let into your country doesn't necessarily have the rights of the citizens of that country. So you can exercise tons of discretion to keep out undesirables, and although this is a really loathsome way of doing it, it would actually be legal.
So
it looks to us as it would be legal.
I mean, I can think of all sorts of practical restraints to be able to do this, right? How do you know someone is a Muslim? Are you going to ask them, to your point, check the box? And if we're trying to keep out bad people, are they really going to be honest when they check that box?
Is that the proxy you want to set up?
But never, I'm shocked. I actually had no idea about this. You're telling me that it would be perfectly lawful to at least set up such a system?
It would be perfectly lawful. So Donald Trump has actually backed down a little bit from this policy, and he said he wants to put in something called extreme vetting. But let's take the example for his words that he first said, which was ban Muslims.
And frankly, if he were to get into office, then he might go with the first idea, right?
He might. He wouldn't be constitutionally constrained to allow Muslims into the country. And so all of our notions of equal protection and treating people fairly under our Constitution does not apply to people trying to get into the country. They don't. Our rights don't carry over to foreigners, and we're allowed to apply whatever criteria we want. And we really do this without blinking an eye in a lot of ways. We do this with, if you have any sort of criminal record, it's a much lower bar than the way we apply it to citizens. citizens and taking
Yeah.
away rights and voting rights. Those are always big issues for citizens. They're much, much more minor issues in the immigration context.
I'm sort of aware of this idea that the court, and this is ultimately the courts have created this plenary power doctrine, I would assume, and I know this, in a lot of different contexts, especially when it comes to foreign affairs, the courts like to step out of this altogether, and just because they don't want to get mired into the morass of foreign policy.
Yeah.
Let's leave that to the president. He's checked by Congress. Presumably, Congress could override any laws the president tried to put in place, right?
Sure, but the courts are really, they see themselves as a poor sort of safeguard against this. They work more slowly. You need the executive who's in charge of national security to make these nimble moves and do what's in the best interest of the country, and the courts do stay away from that in general. Now, tell us something else, Jason. What else does Donald want to do?
Donald Trump's controversial statements about immigration didn't just stop with people who are trying to get into this country. He also had some pretty controversial things to say about the 11 to 14 million undocumented people who are already in this country. Obviously, he said that he wants to round them up, that's his words, and put them on buses and send them back largely to Mexico and Central American countries. There are obviously a considerable number of undocumented workers in this country from Canada and Europe and Africa and other places as well.
Do you think he'd like to round them up as well?
He's
a humanitarian at heart, so rounding things up.
Well, in fairness, he has not drawn a distinction between immigrants depending on where they're from. He has made a general statement about undocumented immigrants. And so, could he do that? Could he, as president, round up all 11 to 14 million undocumented workers and send them back to Mexico? The answer
assuming he could identify them.
Assuming he could identify them, which is a big assumption. It's very hard to do. But he could certainly identify a vast swath of them, right? So, yes. Is it theoretically possible? Yes. The difficulty that he would confront is that the past presidents and Congress have passed a number of laws that restrain the abilities of the president to act in this plenary way with respect to immigrants who are already in this country, undocumented workers who are already in this country.
That's when our laws kick in, right?
Yes.
And so the people here, even though undocumented, have some rights, like maybe not constitutional rights, but legal rights under the statutes we have.
Yeah,
no?
so we've already passed laws, and he would have to repeal those laws in order to actually deport them. So we
work with those laws that work very slowly and go through those channels.
That's right. I think that the image that most people have in their heads when Mr. Trump made these pronouncements, I think what he has in his head is sort of, doing raids on facilities, finding people who don't have proper papers, putting them in buses, and sending them across the border to Mexico and to into Central American countries,
just dumping them there,
and dumping them there, or maybe even returning. I mean, I don't think he's that callous to just dump them in the middle of the desert. He's bring them back to the towns in which they're from, or some sort of thing.
Sure.
But there are a number of procedures and policies in place that restrict that. Specifically, there are laws that require notification in advance of deportation. You have an entitlement to a hearing to make your case for asylum, as it were, because we have a lot of people who would be sent back to countries where they would be considered political opponents. They have a right to a hearing. A judge must oversee that hearing, and then the judge must find a statutory reason for removal and issue that order. And then there must be humane, actual transportation out of the country, so you can't just put somebody in a hot, unair-conditioned bus and send them on a 14-hour bus ride. And these things are already in place. So for Donald Trump to get away with this, he would have to go back to Congress, and Congress would have to actually pass a law, survive a filibuster from a presumably minority member, Democratic members of Congress, and then he would have to sign into law. Assuming all that happened, you still have a ton of practical difficulties in carrying this out. I mean, you mentioned earlier, how do you identify illegal immigrants? There's going to be a tremendous sort of circling of the wagons in the immigrant community to claim people are not, are in fact legally here, to say that they're brothers or cousins of people who are legally here, to fabricate paperwork, I'm sure, not to mention the fact that they will not go down, presumably. You're going to strip children away from parents and parents away from children. If that was my kid, I would not go down without a fight. So you're going to have to deal with a lot of
You're
these
saying because
practical
the children who are born here are American citizens.
The children are born here are American citizens.
He would like to call them anchor babies, and he used to throw this term around as if they're less citizens. Anyone born on U.S. soil, even to an illegal immigrant, is a U.S. citizen.
Yeah,
I think we should just make that very clear.
And that's provided distinctly in the Constitution.
That is
so
a
in order to
Constitution.
get rid of that, he would have to actually repeal a provision of the Constitution, which is an impossible standard for him to meet.
Correct.
So you're talking about literally stripping parents away from kids. There would be obviously a great outrage, not only from the primarily Hispanic community, but also from non-Hispanic communities around the country. So you have some practical limitations, but I think it's worth noting, and not to mention how to get judges to oversee all these hearings. I think it is worth noting, though, that as many hurdles as there are, that a President Trump could, in fact, if he could get it funded, build a wall. He could, in fact, deport hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of illegal, undocumented workers. It would take time. It would be incredibly expensive, but he could successfully do it.
He could do it, and what is a little bit scary, if you find this sort of nightmarish in a way, is that if he gets elected and he's run on this type of platform, he will feel as though he has a mandate to fulfill these promises, right? So if the system has immigration judges with backlogs and he says this would take far too long, I couldn't possibly do it during my 4 years in office or 4 to 8 years in office, so I have to change the system, he would feel compelled, and he would have votes behind him from the country saying, yes, we want you to round up the 11 to 14 million and get them out of the country because that's what you promised us. Isn't that right?
I think that is right, and I think, frankly, he would have a point. I mean,
I do too.
President Obama famously said elections have consequences, and when we as a people decide to elect a leader, he has certainly not been shy about his political views, then he is allowed, within the restraints of the law, with the restraints of the Constitution, to enact those policies to the extent that he can. And, you know, as abhorrent as many people might find it, those policy pronouncements are why he would theoretically be elected.
That's right.
He's not going to be elected in spite of those policy pronouncements.
We've talked about the legal, we've talked about the practical. To me, there's also a moral valence to what he wants to do in this instance. And I say that because we've had a mass relocation and not deportation, but we've had the rounding up of people on our soil in recent history. And what I'm talking about is Japanese internment. This is when we had 110 to 140,000 Japanese people, some of them Japanese legal residents.
Some of them citizens.
Some of them citizens, some of them Japanese Americans.
Who had been here for generations.
And we rounded them up and we put them in internment camps because we perceived them to be enemies of the state during World War II because of the bombing of Pearl Harbor and involvement in the Pacific theater of World War II. Now, that is considered, Jason, one of the most shameful periods of American history, right? I don't think anyone defends Japanese internment. And in fact, there was a Supreme Court case, Korematsu, which said this was grossly unconstitutional, the treatment of these people. And although these are undocumented immigrants, it feels like we would be moving in that direction to round people up and deport them, even if you're not putting them in camps. Doesn't it feel that way to you?
Well, certainly it feels that way to me. I mean, but I have to push back against it again, assuming that what Trump does, the policies he put in place, are enacted by Congress, signed into law by him, and the courts uphold them. Then that's the rule of law. And despite our misgivings about it, and despite what we might think is the moral depravity of doing such a thing, that's the way it goes in a democracy. In a democracy, you take the good and you take the bad, you take them all, and there you have a democracy.
How do we get to the facts of life? I just want to, I think I misspoke. The Korematsu case upheld the constitutionality of that. It was subsequently overturned and considered a black mark in Supreme Court history.
Yeah, and it is, other than slavery, I think, the single most embarrassing chapter in U.S. history. Because we simply did, based on the way that people looked, where their families had once upon a time come from, rounded them up and put them in these awful internment camps.
And this was FDR, so one of the finest presidents in American history. So this is not someone who seems scary.
All right, last point, which I know Derek loves, which is all about suing newspapers because they say bad things about the president.
Jason, this is the one that strikes fear into the hearts of a lot of Americans because all of this seems very abstract to us. You know, Muslims not being allowed into the country, the deportation of undocumented immigrants, but libel laws. Donald Trump has stated, and I quote, "One of the things I'm going to do if I win, and I hope we do, and we're certainly leading, I'm going to open up our libel laws so when they write purposefully negative and horrible and false articles, we can sue them and win lots of money. We're going to open up those libel laws so when the New York Times writes a hit piece, which is a total disgrace, or when the Washington Post, which is there for other reasons, writes a hit piece, we can sue them and win money instead of having no chance of winning because they're totally protected." So what Donald Trump wants to do, and he hasn't been very specific about this, but if you read his words for what they are, when someone writes a negative story about him, he wants to be able to sue them and win money. Why is this so dangerous? Why does this not make you very scared, Jason?
Well, There's two different questions. Why is it so dangerous? Obviously, our country is founded upon, and what makes our country special and unique in the world is that for the entire history of this country, the news media, is the rail of American politics. You cannot touch it. And the news media will report things, and it's not up to politicians to shut them down. You see it all the time. Vladimir Putin shuts down the opposition. And that's exactly what Donald Trump is saying here. He wants to shut down the opposition. He's not saying, if you say false things about me, I can sue you, because that's already the case.
No.
If somebody says false things,
Sure.
he can sue them. What he's saying is they say things that he doesn't like about him. We went through this once upon a time, right? About 240 years ago with the Alien and Sedition laws.
We sure did.
Where John Adams, second president of the United States, did not like what the papers were saying about him, so he enacted the Alien and Sedition laws through the help of friendly folks in Congress to actually punish people who said bad things about the president.
And then good Johnny Marshall came through and struck them down
Supreme
as
Court
unconstitutional.
struck them down. Struck them down, right.
And this is right. I mean, look, the First Amendment and the guarantee of the freedom of the press is one of the most important foundational parts of this country. It's central to our values. Anything else, where in countries that don't have free press, we think of them as being under the thumb of totalitarian dictatorships. You think of Russia and Vladimir Putin not having an entirely free press. China, to some extent, has a very centralized government without freedom of the press.
Many countries in the Middle East, yes.
Jailing of journalists. You don't see that type of stuff here, and there's a reason that this country works the way it does. So this would really, although it hasn't gotten the same press as those other items, it really strikes at the heart of what it is to be an American.
That's right. And I have to just to maybe I'm hoping against hope here that he didn't really mean it. He's been in a war with the media. It's reached a crescendo now, but he's been in a war with the media for the last year and a half that he's been running for president. And I have to think this was just something said in anger without sort of thinking about what it is he's saying and the precedent that would set. Imagine if presidents of the United States could put newspapers out of business because they criticized him or him or her.
It's unfathomable, right? I mean, there's no more public figure than the president of the United States, and they are open to criticism, and we actually encourage that in our system of government. That's what the media is there for. They're as a watchdog, a safeguard to abuses of power. So this is pretty shocking to me, and actually, I hope it doesn't.
So I want to go back and thank Robert for sending this question in. It was great. We love talking about sort of the legalities or lack thereof of the Trump pronouncements. I think generally speaking, except for the last one, he could do it, but it's going to be tough and it might be impractical.
I think that's right.
What's that sound?
It sounds like mail time, Parker.
It's mail time. Don't forget to write in your questions and comments to behindthebar@tmz.com. First one up is from Charlie. It's talking about the heist of Kim Kardashian's diamond. The thieves are getting so much advice from the media on what to do with this diamond ring. What do you think about that?
Oh, I don't think the thieves need our advice. Are
they accusing us of giving a roadmap for how to fence this diamond just by telling them through our podcast how to fence the diamond?
I got to tell you, because I really don't care if Kim Kardashian ever gets her diamond back or anything like that. Nothing would be more flattering than if I found out that this guy's like, I listened to podcasts from TMZ, and it sounds like I'm gonna fence this diamond, and here's how we can do it. We can chop it up into bits and put it on the rings of American women.
Yeah, and
that was a terrible French accent.
It was. I didn't. You're such a Francophile that when you came out with it, I expected a. I don't think we're giving a roadmap. Look, I don't think I'm not happy that the ring was stolen from her. I do hate these forms of conspicuous consumption, so I wouldn't shed many tears if the ring was busted up and ended up on the hands of many different people.
Would you care at all if it's busted up?
I would care very little.
As a matter of fact, it might actually make a lot
more people happy.
Yeah.
All right, we only have two today, so the last one is from Miss Blushing24. It was this is talking about Kanye West and how people could sue for him canceling the show.
Yeah.
Sure.
It was a music festival, not a Kanye West concert. He won't get sued because the audience didn't buy tickets to a Kanye West concert. They bought tickets to the festival.
It doesn't matter.
No.
They bought a ticket, promised to see Kanye West. We talked about the fact that we weren't sure last week how much of the concert he had played. It's come out that he played a great deal of it, so it might be a moot point. But had Kanye West only played 5 minutes for what was expected to be an hour-long set, and people came forward and said, "Hey, of the $100 I spent on this ticket, I spent that because I wanted to see Kanye West, and he walked off in 5 minutes. Give me my my money back, they'd have a good claim.
Now, the one caveat I would say is if Kanye was a surprise guest at a music
of
festival,
course.
then of course you have no expectation of seeing Kanye. It was all gravy to see him at all, so you would have no suit if he left early.
You got to think it all as contractually, right? But when you buy a ticket, you are signing a contract with the person who sold you the ticket.
You want the benefit of that
and
bargain.
you want the benefit of that bargain, and they have an obligation to give it to you. And if they only give you 5% of the benefit of that bargain, you're entitled to 95% of your money back.
That's right, and I'll give you my business card, and
Yeah.
we'll see to it.
All right, thanks so much, everybody. Remember, not only watch us on YouTube, listen to our podcast, download, listen, subscribe, send us your reviews. We love to hear them. Obviously, we will take your suggestions
You
for
could
topics.
be the next Robert Ketch and have us do a whole podcast about your topic.
So thanks very much. See you next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for watching. If you want more nerdy deep dives into the legal side of celebrity news, hit our subscribe button right here.
And check out our previous episodes over here.